Welcome or welcome back. Today we're going to be painting a Rudolph painting, even though it might be a little out of season. We're going to start out by going over the materials you're going to need for this project. You're going to need 2 brushes. The first brush is going to be a small round brush. I'm using a 0, but you can use anything up to a size 2. You'll also be needing an angle brush. I'm using a 1/2 inch angle brush. If you don't have an angle, you can use a flat. I just like how versatile the angle brush is. I'm going to be using this glass paint palette to put my paints on today, but you can use a plate or palette paper or anything that suits your needs. The colors we're going to use are phthalo green, titanium white, chrome yellow, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, fire red, and Mars black. These are all Blickrylic student acrylic colors. You'll also need this traceable that you can find at the link below, tracing paper or carbon paper, and a painting surface. I'm using an 8x10 stretched canvas that has been gessoed over another painting, but you can use a bunch of different things such as paper or canvas boards. The first thing you're going to do is position your carbon paper on your canvas with the shiny side touching the canvas. You're going to use some masking tape and tape it down so that it doesn't wiggle around while you are tracing. I just taped 2 sides so that I can peek behind the top and the bottom to make sure that I don't miss anything. And then you're going to lay your traceable right on top and line it up the best that you can, and also tape it down so that it doesn't move. This one is more important that it doesn't move while you're tracing it than the carbon paper will be. I use a ballpoint pen to trace over mine because I can kind of see where I've already marked, but you can use anything such as the end of your paintbrush to outline your image, and it will transfer your image to the canvas. Very slowly, you're going to trace over the entire image. It's okay if you go outside of the line a little bit, but just try your best to keep as close to the black lines as possible. And this is one of those paintings where there's going to be a lot of filling in and not painting shapes on top of a background. So it's pretty important to have a rough shape of what we're going to be painting. Once you're done tracing your image, you can just check underneath your carbon paper to make sure that your image transferred. Mine transferred very lightly because I didn't press very hard, and that is all right. Then you can go ahead and take your tape and peel off your carbon paper and your transfer image because we don't need them anymore. Normally, I paint my image around the sides of my canvas. However, for some of these paintings, I'm just going to be painting the surface because that's really what you can see, and it's a little distracting for me to paint the sides. But if you want to paint the sides, go ahead and do that. And if you want to just paint them one solid color once we're all done, you can also do that. We're going to start with our 1/2 inch angle brush or a flat brush if that's what you're using. I'm going to get it damp because this helps the paint move a little bit better. Get off some of the extra water. And the first thing we're going to do is paint in our sky. So I'm grabbing some of this ultramarine blue, and I'm just going to go over the entire sky using this ultramarine blue and a little bit of this titanium white. And it's going to just lighten up the sky just a slight bit, and it's also going to help cover up this canvas because that ultramarine blue is pretty transparent because of it being student paint. I don't paint the background very directional in this painting because it's a little bit more difficult to do that whenever you're painting around a subject. So I kind of just almost do my paint in a cross motion like an X, and I go one way and then back over the other way because it makes it look pretty uniformly painted, but it has a little bit of a texture almost look to it, like there's clouds in the sky. But it's really difficult to get maybe like a horizontal direction with your paint whenever you're painting around these objects. And I just very carefully go around my shapes as I'm going around. It's okay if you paint into them a little bit because we are going to be painting the reindeer after we get the background in, which is why we're doing the background first, just so that we have a little bit of wiggle room to cover up some of that sky, because it's more important that our object looks like it's in front of our sky than our sky in front of our object. The next thing we're going to be doing is painting the snow on the ground, and it's going to be using the same blue and white, so it looks like the sky is almost casting some of its color onto the snow, because just plain white snow is a little bit boring in paintings and pretty flat looking. So I'm just going to get some of the extra paint off of my brush, and I'm going to grab just blue to start out with. Here it's going to be a little bit more important to keep a direction with your paint. So I'm taking that blue, and just where my horizon line is, I'm just adding some blue paint across my horizon on the right side of my canvas. And I'm going to work some white paint just into where that blue is, and I'm going to work it down. And eventually this is going to be a little bit darker where our horizon line is, and it's going to fade into a very, very light blue or just plain white at the bottom of the canvas. So here I've got quite a bit of blue in my snow, and I'm just going to add some white as I go down. I'm very carefully going around the outside. I still have quite a bit of paint in my brush, so I'm just working some of it out and filling this area. I'm going to clean out my brush before moving on to make sure that I don't have too much blue paint. So here I'm going to grab some more white. I'm just going to work that into the bottom because I want this to fade into more of a snow look. So we don't want blue snow. We just want it to look like there is a reflection on our snow, so it gives our snow a little dimension. And you can work straight back up and fade all that back into that blue. And we can come back in, change it after a little while. We just want to get some of all of this background in first. It's hard to tell maybe what it needs to look like until some more of your painting starts to come in. And right here above our Rudolph, there is a little bit more snow that's on like a really high snow bank. So we're going to add some of this blue again in that direction of the bank. We're adding it right where the top of it is, and then we're going to clean out a brush and grab some more white and work it back in just like we did with the other side. If you want to just use some water like I am here to blend it out before you grab some of the white paint, you can. Acrylic paint is water-based, so you can blend it out almost like you could with watercolor for a very short time. It won't reactivate, but it will move around. And we're going to use that here in a little while for our eyes as well, because our eyes are also white, but we don't want them to look flat. So we're going to do the same thing there. So I'm just trying to get a really nice gradient in my snow. So it looks like there's a shadow on the top of my hill. I'm going to clean out my brush because I don't want very much paint on my brush while I'm doing this, because it's very, very subtle, especially here in the beginning before I know what the rest of my colors are going to look like as I'm putting this on. I'm just grabbing a little tiny bit of blue, and here the inside of our ears are white as well. So we're going to add blue paint just along the inside of our ear on the left-hand side of this ear. And it's going to look like there's a slight shadow in there. So I put my blue paint on, I'm cleaning out my brush, and I'm just going to fan that out with just a damp brush. And it makes it a little bit easier to add some white paint. If you don't want to add the white paint and you like the way that it looks with just this blue paint faded out with water, you can do that. But I found that it's a little easier to fade out with water first and then add your paint. The paint just brightens up the opposite side a little bit, so it looks like we have a nice little shadow in our ear. And again, I'm going to clean out my brush. I'm going to grab just a tiny bit of that blue and I'm going to jump to the other ear. So this one is going to be on the right side of this ear. And I'm playing with our shadows a little bit because I don't have a perfect reference for this because of the way the movie was filmed. Shadows might look a little different. So I'm just doing the best that I can to make it appear like it has some depth without using a reference. I'm just fanning out some of that blue so it looks like it fades. And then I'm going to grab some white and brighten up the other side and fade it back into that blue because this didn't fade quite as well as the first one on the first try. That's okay. I just got lucky the first time. I'm just going to try and fade it out again so it looks a little bit more like the other side. It might take a little finessing, so here I'm just darkening up that edge a little bit because I fanned out all of my color. And now I have a really harsh line, so I have to fade that back out again. And I'm just cleaning out my brush every time I go in because it'll just turn into a hot mess if I have a bunch of color on my brush. And it's okay if they look a little different. I'm just trying to get them to look a little bit more similar. We're going to move on to the eyes now because they're just like the ears. So they have this big white area. And we're going to grab a little bit of blue, just like with the ears, and we're going to add it around the left side of this eye. And we're going to fan it out with water, just like we did with the ears. If you're struggling with making this fade out, or you just really don't like the blue, you can definitely just put white paint inside of your eyes and your ears and just leave it white. I just think that it adds a lot of dimension, just adding a little bit of blue like we did with our snow. I'm going to brighten up the middle of my eye because I don't want any blue on the most rounded part of our eye because it would look the most shiny. I'm going to grab a little more blue and jump over to the other eye. And this one's going to be on the opposite side because that's furthest away from us. I'm going to fade this out again with just water. And I faded all of my paint out, so I'm just grabbing a little bit more blue to have a really nice hard blue line. And adding that bright white for a shine. It's easier to get these washes in before we put in the colors around them so that we can clean up our edges with more opaque layers of paint. I had to wait a minute to put a little bit more blue because my eye was just a little too wet. So I'm frequently cleaning out my brush. I'm grabbing just water. I'm going to try and fan this out again. And again, if you're struggling with this and it's just really not that important to you, just paint them white or leave them the white canvas, whatever you like. I'm using an angle brush, so I'm constantly changing the direction of my brush so I can get into those small corners. But I like that I can cover a large area and get into small spaces with these really nice angle brushes. The little area on his chest underneath his head is also white, so we're going to just add a little bit of blue around the side and around the area that's right underneath his face a little bit. Fade it out with some water. And we can always come back and adjust these as we start adding other colors. I'm just adding some white for that bright area. But paintings are just kind of a nice rhythm of working back and forth to see what looks right as you go along. So I'm just cleaning all that blue out of my brush. We're going to switch over to our small round brush. We're going to get it damp just as always. Get off that extra water. I struggle with little beads of water on this brush, so every once in a while you'll see me kind of wiping my fingers along the brush to get off a little drops of water. I'm going to grab some black and we're going to start filling some things in. So we're going to fill in the black parts of the eye. Aside from just being really careful while you're painting in these black eyes, there's really not much to it. I just use the tippy toes of my brush. And if you're painting this painting, you probably already know a little bit about this Rudolph. So this Rudolph was first aired on December 6th, 1964 on NBC. Since 1964, the show has run every single year on TV, making it the longest running Christmas TV special. The movie was filmed using a stop-motion animation process called animagic. Animagic was achieved by using puppets and constantly changing the position of the puppets and taking pictures to create a stop-motion film. There's a lot of movies that also use claymation to achieve this, but this particular one used puppets. Once you're done with the eyes, you're going to clean out your brush, and we're going to add another white area in here with some of that blue using this round brush. So it's damp, and I'm going to use the blue and white, and there's a small area on his mouth that is also going to be white. So the top part is going to be brown, but the bottom half of his little nose is white. So I'm going to take this blue and I'm adding a small blue line underneath his nose, and around there's a crease on the side of his little mouth that I made on the template. I'm going to fan that out using this small round brush. And this might be a little bit more difficult to get a gradient because of the small area that it's in. It's going to kind of look like he's got a blue mustache at first. And this doesn't have to have a really, really solid line where they connect. It's just to make it look a little less flat. I'm going to grab white paint and go underneath the mouth. And you can add a little bit of blue paint under the mouth as well, because it will have a little bit of a shadow as well. I'm cleaning off my brush, just grabbing a little tiny bit of blue, and I'm just coming in here on the very edge of it. I had a bunch of water in my brush that just kind of dripped off. I do that a lot with these really small round brushes. So I'm just adding some blue so that it looks like it's separated from the snow. And I'm going to come in here a few times in a little while, and I'm going to add it to the ground as well to make sure that his chest and his mouth and the snow all look like they're separate from each other. But for now, I'm just trying to look like the mouth has a little bit more dimension and adding a little bit of blue in here. And once we add the red to the mouth and the nose, it'll definitely help it as well. And again, if you get frustrated trying to make this gradient with the blue and white, you can just leave it white. The nice thing is that the white paint will completely cover up all of that blue paint if you get frustrated or if you need to make any adjustments. If it starts getting too muddy and looks like you have a bright blue mouth, just let that dry or dry it with a hair dryer and come back with white paint and start all over. I'm just going to spend a minute here working on my gradient in my mouth. Once the mouth looks the right way, for however you want it to look. You're going to switch over to your angle brush again. We're going to make sure that it's damp, and we're going to grab that burnt sienna, and we're going to start painting in some of his fur. So I'm going to start on the ear because it's furthest away from where I paint from, so I don't drag my arm through a bunch of wet paint. I'm using an angle brush. If this ends up easier for you using a round brush, it'll take a little longer, but you can use your round brush, or if you have a flat brush, you can also use that. My angle brush is starting to get a little rough, so it's got a big old split in it that I keep fighting with. I'm going to try and work back out, and the end of my brush has also sat in quite a bit of water, so it starts separating from the handle. So you'll notice that every once in a while I have to keep readjusting it because it's starting to fall out of the handle, and I don't switch to a new brush until the end of the painting. I thought I could make it, but not quite. I'm not painting the head yet. I'm just painting the ear, because if we were to paint all of it together, we'd start losing the edges where our ear and our head meet, and we're going to be adding in some highlights. So for now, I'm trying to keep all of the parts separate so that we can gradually add those highlights so we don't lose any of our lines where our body parts meet. Once you're finished with putting on that layer of burnt sienna, you're going to take your brush and dip it in the white paint, and we're going to be adding a highlight. So our light source is going to be coming from our upper right hand side. I'm going to make sure that I have just a little tiny bit of white, and I'm going to run it right along the edge where our ear and the sky meet on the right hand side, because that's where the sun would hit the top of the ear. And it's just going to lighten up some of that burnt sienna so that it looks like there's a highlight there. The other half of our ear is starting to dry now, so I'm just going to grab a little bit of that burnt sienna. I'm going to add to it so it doesn't look quite so transparent. We're going to come back and add some more layers here in a little while to make sure that all this is filled in if you need to, but I like to save a little bit of time and just add it as I can. We're going to go over to the other ear, and we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to paint the entire ear in this burnt sienna. Once you've got the color in, you're going to take that brush and dip it in that titanium white. We're going to add that highlight just like we did with the other one. This one we're going to add a little bit of white to the entire thick part of this ear because it's closer to our light source, so it's probably going to catch a little bit more light. So we're just going to lighten up the entire side of this ear. I'm just blending it in. It doesn't have to be perfect, because his ear might not be perfectly round. I'm just blending it in the best that I can. And the other side, we're also going to put a highlight because it's probably getting quite a bit of light as well. And I really like how this white blends out this burnt sienna. I'm leaving the bottom half of this ear a little bit darker on this side because it's starting to get further away from our light source and is tucked behind our ear a little bit. Once you're done with the ears, you can clean out your brush, and we're going to switch to his legs. So you're going to want to start fresh with your colors so that you aren't starting with a light color. We're going to add the burnt sienna to this little leg on the body at the bottom. And we're going to add a small highlight on top of this leg. My leg gets really light at first, so I am going to change it later, but I'm going to grab that white and add it to the top because I put way too much white paint on such a small area that it just kind of lightens the entire thing. But there's not too much you can do while it's still wet, so you have to wait for it to dry before you can really darken it up. So I'm just going to blend it in for now and try to add a little bit of darkness to the bottom of it, but really that's about all you can do for now. I'm going to grab the burnt sienna. I'm going to come to this other little leg that's tucked behind our body over here and do the same thing. I'm adding a highlight because I like the way that it looks, but you don't have to because his leg is pretty tucked back, but it might be getting a little bit of light, so I'm adding some of that white to it. Plus I just really like how this white blends with this burnt sienna. But it's your painting, so you can do whatever you want. We're gonna get this little top of our nose, which is also brown. So we're gonna grab that burnt sienna and fill it in. I'm using my angle, but you can use your round or whatever's easiest for you. Once you get the hang of turning your angle brush while you're painting with it, it will probably become one of your favorite brushes as well. That or a filbert, which is has a rounded end on it and it doesn't have pointed edges. Grab some of that white and add a small highlight to the top of our nose. And that is going to separate it from our face once we fill that in. So I'm just getting a damp brush and filling that in. Sometimes you need to take some of the paint off of your brush whenever you do this because there's just too much on it to blend it out really nicely. We're going to switch back to our round brush and fill in some other areas. So I'm going to start by filling in the nose with red. Once you're finished putting in that red, we're also going to add a highlight to our nose. You're going to dip your round brush in white paint and just come along the top of your nose with that white paint and blend it right in along the edge, and you can bring it out into your nose a little bit more because our nose is round, so we just want the top of that roundness to look like it has some shininess to it. It's going to look like a pink color. I'm just blending that in so it fades out really nicely. We also need to fill in the mouth with red, but I'm going to clean out my brush so I don't have that pink on it. I'm going to grab the red paint and fill in the mouth. We do not need a highlight in our mouth because there's probably no light getting inside of there. Once you're finished with the mouth, we're going to do the little beginning antlers on top of his head, but the burnt sienna isn't dark enough, so I'm going to scoop some of it out away from the original paint I'm working from, and I'm just going to darken it up a little bit with a little bit of black. I don't need too much because they're pretty small, but I want a nice little pile of brown paint. I'm going to get off some of this extra on my brush because it's hard to grab some extra paint while it's full of paint. Grab a little tiny bit of black, not too much. We just want it dark enough so that it doesn't blend in with the rest of our body. And it should turn into a nice dark brown. And you're just going to fill in those antlers. Like with most of the things that we fill in, there's not too much technique. It's just keeping it really nice and even on the tip of your brush and filling it in. You're going to switch back to your angle or flat brush because I forgot the tail whenever we're filling in all the extra little parts. So I'm just going to fill in the tail with this burnt sienna. And we'll add a highlight just like we did with the ears. It should only take a second. Grab a little bit of white on there along the edge that meets the sky. We're just going to add a little highlight along that edge and make it fade really nicely back into the rest of our burnt sienna. And that's all there is to it. You can go and clean out that brush. Switch back to that round brush and we're going to mix up a new color using the phthalo green and the ultramarine blue. So I'm going to scoop a little bit of each into a pile. You want a little bit more green than blue. We're just trying to darken up that phthalo green. And I don't always like doing that with black, so I'm scooping that on top. And you want to be careful whenever you mix paints to not stir them around, and you kind of want to just tap them around unless you're using a palette knife, and you just fold them into each other, which is an option. So I'm just going to keep on adding green and blue to this mixture until it looks like a really nice dark green. And that phthalo green already has a blue undertone to it, so you want to be careful so that it doesn't stay too blue. And these are going to be used in the back trees that are behind the two main trees, so it looks like they're a little bit different from each other. Now I'm just painting this tree back here. The trees in front are just going to be phthalo green, or you can add a little bit of white to them if they don't look too different from this green that we're adding here in the background. Working from a limited palette is really nice, and finding different ways to add some values to your paints, and adding blue to this green is a really nice way to do that without mixing black into all of your colors. You're going to clean out your brush before painting the trees in the front. So here you're just taking that phthalo green and you're painting those trees in the front. If they don't look different enough from the trees in the background, you can just add a little bit of white to it. Mine is very, very subtle, so you might not be able to see on the camera the difference between the trees in the back and the tree in the front. Once I've got that tree done, I'm going to clean out my brush and I'm going to add a second layer to my trees because the colors that I added were pretty transparent. So I will see you once I've got my second layers on. Now that our trees are done, we're going to go back to our face. We're going to use our angle brush. We're going to add in our highlight while we're working on the head, but I'm just taking this burnt sienna and I'm applying it to the top of our head. So the other parts of our face that we filled in were pretty small, so it wasn't an issue with working on top of wet paint, but our face is very large, so if we were to paint the entire face and then go back and try and blend in our highlight, the paint would likely already be dry. So we're going to work on the face kind of in segments, so we need to work on our highlight up here on the head while it's still wet. So I'm working pretty fast and adding this burnt sienna to the top of the head, and I need to have the highlight in before I work down. So I'm just carefully adding a pretty thick area of this burnt sienna at the top so I have a little bit of area to work from with my highlight. I'm just getting as much paint off of my brush as possible. I'm going to grab a little bit of that white in this small little area, and I'm going to come along where the top of the head is and add this in. And I'm going to blend that out. And here it is kind of important to use that directional line because you do want the sense that his head is smooth. In things like the sky, it doesn't really matter as much because it can be interpreted different ways, but I'm adding this really light color all across the top of the head. Here I still have quite a bit of paint on my brush, so I'm adding it to the forehead as it is, but I ran out and my paint brush got pretty dry, so I'm just going to add some more brown back to it. And here I'm using a really wide brush to do this, so if it's easier for you to switch to a smaller brush in between the antlers, you can. So I'm just getting some more of that brown paint off of my brush so I don't have to keep on cleaning out my brush. And I'm just coming across the rest of the forehead area before I grab some more white paint and add a highlight on this side as well. And remember, you do have to work pretty quickly while your paint's still wet. If it dries before you get a chance to add the highlight and blend your colors in, you can just grab some more paint and put another layer on and come back. So I'm coming in and adding white, and this area is really tricky with this wide brush. So I'm spreading out some of that white paint because there really didn't need to be that much for in between that area. And I'm just blending it out. And you can try and add some more burnt sienna into it if you need to, if your color starts getting a little too light, unless you like the way that it looks really light. And once that highlight looks really nice and blended, like it fades out really nicely, you can continue moving on to filling in the rest of your head in that burnt sienna color. But mine is taking a little while to make sure that I have a really nice smooth edge on the top. Coming up from the horns, it looks like it still connects at the same spot on either side of the horn. And once it's right, you can go ahead and grab that burnt sienna and finish painting the rest of your face. When you're finishing up the face, you might be thinking that your face looks pretty choppy and uneven. That's okay because we're gonna put another layer on our face. You just can't layer up paint while it's wet. It's always an option to dry it with a hairdryer in between layers, but I think that just takes up a lot of time. I'm going around and just adding a few spots of some more color. It's not necessary because we are going to add another layer. I just wanted to darken up some really light spots. We're going to move on to the body next, and just like the head, we have the area at the top that's going to need highlighted before our paint dries, so we're going to work on it in sections. So I'm going to paint the top of the body this burnt sienna. My second layer is going to be a lot more directional than this first layer, but I'm trying to get some of the extra paint off of my brush so that I have a really clean line along the edge of my back as I'm sloping down. And I want a fairly thick layer of paint. I'm stopping where the neck connects into the body because we're going to have a direction change with our paint and our highlight right where that line from our neck comes into our body. So now I'm going to grab my highlight real quick before my paint dries. Just like with the other ones, we're just adding a little bit of white to the top of the back. It's always best to start with less and work your way to more white as you need it, because it's a little bit easier to add the white paint than it is to darken it back up. I'm just going over the paint over and over until it blends really nice and smoothly. And I'm going to work it down into the body so that it fades really nicely. Here I'm going to go ahead and quickly add that spot in the neck so that I don't lose it. So I'm just using a little bit of that burnt sienna and that white to mark where that's at so that I don't lose it here while I'm painting the rest of the body. And I'm going to grab some of that burnt sienna without the white after I clean my brush, and I'm going to darken it up just a little bit because it was really, really, really light. And you'll carefully get under the neck and paint down. I'm only doing it just enough so that I don't lose my neck while I'm painting the body. So I'm going to move back to the body and fill the rest of it in. This goes pretty quick because it's pretty wide and open, and you don't have too many things in your way that you have to paint around until you get to the leg. Here I was able to use a little bit more paint while I was working because the area is a lot larger, so it looks like it covered just slightly better than the head, but either way it's going to get another coat of paint as well. I'm going around the leg in kind of an arch motion because the direction just kind of matters right now, but I don't want it to be in a direction that would be different than if I were to pet a deer and go around his shoulders and down his neck and around his belly and his back. Now I'm just smoothing out the neck area and blending that into the rest of what I was painting, and I'll slowly get around this chest area. And this is all just that burnt sienna color. Whenever you paint paintings from an outline, you have to be careful to not lose your line, and that's the only reason why we had to jump to the neck real quick and add in that highlight, because it's really careful to lose your lines. And it's always possible to just guess where it was and add it back in, but we're just being careful the first time to save ourselves some time. And as I'm getting to the smaller space, I'm using less paint because I don't want a bunch of globby paint sliding around my canvas. And just like that, our painting is starting to finally take shape. We're going to switch back to our round brush and we're going to finish our little antler horns. So our brush is redampened. We're going to grab that dark brown. We're going to add a second coat to our antlers just so that they're nice and filled in. If you don't want to add a second layer, you don't have to. And realistically, antlers aren't going to be shiny most of the time. if they maybe have like a little bit of fur on them, but ours are going to be shiny. So after we get this brown on, we want to work pretty quickly so that our paint is still wet, and we're going to add a little bit of shine to the top. Mine stays pretty white, so it doesn't really blend in with my paint, but you can blend it in so that it's a lighter brown if you want to. But I thought that they looked pretty flat, so I'm going to add a shine. I'm going to clean out my brush before I do it so I don't have too much brown paint. I'm going to grab some of that white. Got a little water droplet on there. And right on the tops, I'm just going to add little shine marks. They're kind of like parentheses that are just around the top of our little antlers. And I'm going to add one to our nose, just right on the top to make it look a little extra shiny. And clean off your brush. This next part, we're going to add some yellow to our trees in the background. It's just going to be a little bit of garland to make them stand out a little bit. So I just start on the top left and swoop down like there's garland draping on our trees. And you can grab a little bit of white with your paint if it's really not showing up, but it's okay if it's not perfectly bright and showing up because they're pretty far away. If you want, you can add a couple little ornaments to your trees back here as well, but I'm just going to leave it as a garland so it doesn't take away from the main focus of our painting, which is the Rudolph. The sky looks a little washed out, so I'm going to grab this angle brush and I'm going to go back through it, and I'm just going to do that little X motion again, and I'm going to roughly put in some more blue around my sky. I'm not going to add any white this time. I'm just adding this blue to darken it up a little bit, and it will make it contrast a little bit more with that snow. And I will see you when I'm done. So you'll notice that my sky doesn't look perfectly even. It looks a little choppy, and that's okay in a sky. It gives it a little extra texture without taking away from your painting. Now I'm going to add a little bit more to the snow so that it sets out a little bit different from our Rudolph. So I'm going to just darken up a little bit around the edges where my body is so that you can see a clear definition where the Rudolph is. Our body isn't close enough to really cast a shadow on the snow, so in real life, his chest might blend into the snow, which would work in his favor if it was a real reindeer, but ours isn't. So I'm just going to add a little bit more blue to the snow so that I can see a difference in our painting. I'm using a little bit of water to blend this out just like I did initially, but this time I'm just being a little bit more loose about it. I still want it to look like it fades out a little bit, but I'm just kind of playing with the white and the blue so that it looks like it's naturally fading, both from the top and from around the body. So my mouth is also white, and I want it to look like it sets out from the background. And the top of my hill can get a little bit darker than the bottom can. Now that I have so much color on here, it's hard to just fade it out, so I'm adding some white paint to it as well, just to help get a really nice gradient. Just like with the other parts of the painting, don't get frustrated with this. If you want it to be more white, you can just leave it all white. To get this nice streaky looking texture to your snow, you're going to want to use a dry brush and get all of the water and most of the paint off, and just get a little bit of paint on it and drag it across that color. I'm going to add a second coat to the body now and just get it out of the way. So I've got some more burnt sienna on my brush, and this time I'm going to be a lot more careful about keeping my brush going in one direction. If you don't want it to go in one direction, these animals in the movie were made out of felt, so they look kind of choppy and furry. So I guess if you don't want to make it directional, you don't have to. It just kind of helps in a painting to make it look like that object is rounded. And I'm adding that highlight back to it with that white paint. I got a lot of white paint, so I'm going to have to go back and forth quite a few times to get this blended in and grab some more brown and add to it too. I just got some of that paint off of my brush so I can help blend it in, and I'm just using water to blend it into that brown that I just added. I'm just cleaning up all of my lines. And now I can start adding some more brown back into it. This should be the only extra layer that you're adding to your painting, so you'll want to make sure that it's nice and finished once it's on. Once you're done with that part of the body, you can move on to the neck. My back got pretty light, so it's okay if I take this dark right along the edge of the neck. And I'm actually going to add a little bit of a shadow underneath where the head meets the neck too, to make sure that they definitely look like they are separated. So I'm just going to finish adding all of this around the chest and the neck. And to add that shadow underneath the head, I'm just going to take this same brush and I'm going to grab a little bit of black, just a really small amount. And my brown is still wet, so it should blend in really nicely. And just carefully under the neck, I'm just going to put my black under here and fade it out. Careful to not get too much. If you did, just clean out your brush. I have tons of black on there now, so I'm just cleaning out all of the paint from my brush and I'm going to blend that into the brown. And because I got so much black paint, I'm going to have to use quite a bit of brown paint to blend it out. I don't want to take this color down too far because it's supposed to just be a small shadow. So right now I'm just working on getting this black to have a really nice crisp line underneath the head and to just come down enough to where I can start adding some burnt sienna and blending it back into the normal color of the body. So here I've pretty much got it, so I'm just smoothing it out. And I don't want it to have this crisp black line right up next to the body, so I'm just trying to blend it in as well. Now I'm going to add that highlight back into the side using a little bit of white paint so that it stands out against the back of the body. I got a ton of white on there, so I'm just cleaning out my brush and now I'm going to blend it out. Here my brush is starting to fall apart, so you're going to see me fidgeting with it quite a bit until I switch my brushes. So I'm just going to carefully blend that white out. It's okay if you have a fairly solid white line because it can just look like he has a really hard highlight on his back shining around his neck. And it's okay if your black isn't perfectly smoothed out because shadows aren't always perfectly shaped. I'm just taking this brown and I'm blending out all of my coloring that I just did. Now that the body's done, I'm going to finish up this leg. And again, I'm going to try and be a little bit more careful this time to not get so much white. So I'm putting on that burnt sienna. I'm going to leave a small gap where I had that highlight because I'm going to be adding it back on anyways. So I'm taking a little bit of white and I'm going to round it just like before. And again, I added a ton of white. So I'm cleaning out my brush and I'm going to blend it in the best that I can with just a clean brush with water. Once that's blended out pretty nicely, I'm going to just add some more burnt sienna. There we go. I'm going to switch over to this other little baby leg and add some more of that burnt sienna and try to be a little bit more careful. And I'm adding a little bit of black on this too to add a little bit of a shadow because it is technically tucked behind the body. And you can do this with a smaller brush. I'm just going to make this entire area a little darker because the whole thing is behind the body. And I'm going to just smooth it out with some more burnt sienna. If you just want this to be a plain brown and just want to add a little bit of black for the lines meet, you can do that too. You just don't want it to look like he has a lump growing off of his chest. I'm going to switch back to that round brush and I'm going to add the highlight in with this brush because the area is pretty small. add some more brown in there to blend out some of that highlight that I added. And I lost a little bit of that shadow, so I'm going to be cleaning up my brush and adding a little bit of black back in here. Sometimes painting is just working back and forth until your colors kind of just work the way that they need to. So I just have to add my shadow back in here. And I don't want it to have a harsh line on this one, so I'm just going to blend it out with some water. And my other paint is still pretty wet, so I'm just going to layer up some of these colors. One side of the leg is behind, and then the other side has a little bit of a highlight from the sun, or you can just have the whole thing shadowed. It's up to you. I'm just trying to get a little bit of both. You can clean out your brush whenever you're all done with that, and we'll get moving on over here to the tail. I want to add a little bit of shadow because it's kind of tucked behind the booty a little bit. So I'm just going to add a little bit of black and fade it out using some brown because I didn't get brown on the tail first this time. I got a little water droplet on my brush. So I'm just adding brown after this time and blending it into that black and fading it up. And it doesn't have to be a really big shadow. So I got a lot of a shadow going up, so I'm just cleaning up my brush and I'm going to just add brown above that and blend it out into the tail. And I want to make sure that I keep a highlight on the tail as well, so I'm going to need to grab a little bit of white and add it to the edge as well. And of course blend it out just like we did with the last leg. We're getting there now. I'm just going to take my brush and grab a little bit of black paint, and I'm going to add it to the ear because it's tucked up behind the head a little bit, so it's going to cast just a small shadow. I'm just going to blend that out with a little bit of brown paint. This is something I could have done earlier, but I just realized that it needed a little something extra so it didn't look quite so flat. I'm also going to add it where the brown of the ear meets the white part of the ear because that's looking a little flat as well, and I want it to look like the brown part is raised up a little bit higher than the white part. And the idea is the same as the tail and the leg and the ear that we already did. You're just going to take a little bit of black paint on your brush, add it along the edge. You're going to take a little bit of brown paint and you're just going to blend them together until it turns into a dark brown and fade them down a little bit. And this spot is pretty small and I don't want it to be really strong. I just want it to be really subtle. So it's just a little extra something. It's these little parts of your painting that are really going to give it a lot of depth and not look like it is just a flat colored picture. I'm going to extend the shadow all the way to the top because his ear probably folds a little bit, or at least has a small crease here at the very top of it. And while we're at it, we're just gonna hit the top of that ear again, just for good measure. It looks like my whole top of my ear has been highlighted and I want it to give it a little bit more depth. So I'm just gonna add some more brown paint to the spot above that white area, and I'm going to add more highlight to the very top to make sure that it looks like it has a difference between the two colors. Now we're going to switch over to the other ear and we're going to do the same thing, adding a little bit of black where the ear sits just behind the head. This one is a little bit further away. I want to make sure that the shadow is a little bit smaller. Even though it's further away, we have less ear to work with back here. So I have my black with some brown. I'm just going to blend them together to make a really nice dark brown. And I'm going to fade this up, so it's okay if you have a lot of paint on your brush at first. We just want to make sure that there's a nice dark brown at the bottom. Every once in a while I wipe the paint off of my brush if it gets too globby and it's hard to get a really small end on it. You can use a flat brush on this part, but because we're blending in such small areas, it's a little bit easier to use this brush. Here I'm putting down the brown paint before the black paint, just so it blends in. It blends in the same way. It just might be a little bit easier if you do the brown paint first. I'm going to add the highlight in while my brown paint is still wet. And I'm just going to finish this process just like I did with the other ear. I'm going to be switching to a different angle brush because my other one broke, and I'm tired of trying to keep it together. So if I switch brushes, don't think that you need to too. It's just the same angle brush, just a different brush. So I'm just re-wetting this, and this is going to be my new angle brush. So if you see a silver one, that's what it is. So I'm going to go back to the face and finish it up. I'm going to add some burnt sienna back to it, and this is kind of the same concept with the body. We're just adding more color to the face, adding our highlight back in, and just making sure that there's a nice thicker layer on the face. You might need to switch back and forth between your round and your flat here in the small areas where our highlight is, because it might just be a little bit easier to work with your flat brush because the space is pretty small and my angle brush is pretty big. So I'm just re-blending out my highlight to start out with so I can blend it all down into that darker brown. I'm going to switch to my small round brush again, and I'm going to grab some black paint, and I'm just going to touch up the blacks in our eyes, make sure that the line is nice and smooth and that the color is filled in really dark. If you need to clean up the little shine marks in the eyes, you can also do that. Just make sure your brush is really cleaned out, and just use white paint. I accidentally had a bunch of water on my brush, so I dripped some water on this little spot, so I'm just going to go back over it. If you just want to leave them blank canvas, you can also do that. And that is all there is to this painting. You do have the option with this one to take your small round brush and black paint and outline the entire canvas. So you can go very carefully around each one of the antlers, around the sides, around the eyes, the nose, and you can do that, and it can replace some of that shading so that you didn't have to have really specific shading in between. This is another painting that I've done where I just outlined and I didn't have as much shading. So I really hope you enjoyed doing this painting with me today. I really enjoyed doing it with you, and I will catch you in the next one.